Everyone, thanks for coming. I'm Vanessa Strange, the Adult Services Manager for Spokane Public Library. And I'm going to start by reading our land acknowledgement written with the Spokane Tribe of Indians. All Spokane Public Library buildings sit on the traditional homelands of the 4 bands of the Spokane Tribe of Indians: Upper Band, Middle Band, Lower Band, and Chewelah Band. Since time immemorial, the Spokane Tribe of Indians has lived and cared for these grounds, identifying themselves as Skillik, or flesh of the earth. We pay our respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. We show gratitude to the land, river, and peoples who have been fishing, hunting, harvesting, and gathering here for generations. May we learn from one another's stories so that we may nurture the relationship of the people of the Spokane Tribe and all those who share this land. Thank you. So I wanted to quickly ask where you heard about this event by a show of hands. Was it a personal email from someone that you know? All right, that's most of them. All right, email, newsletter. All right, cool. We're going to be going past the closing time of the library at 7 o'clock. So the rest of the staff will close the building and then we'll exit out the front doors when we're finished. Like I said, I'm the Adult Services Manager and I've been working with Dr. Kabides to bring visiting lectures to the Spokane Public Libraries. Dr. Kasahun Kabide teaches in the Sociology Department at Eastern Washington University and currently holds the Jeffers Chertok Memorial Professorship. Part of that includes a fund that makes guest lectures like this possible. And our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Asad L. Asad, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Stanford University, where he studies how citizenship and legal status matter for multiple forms of inequality. He's the author of Engage and Evade: How Latino Immigrant Families Manage Surveillance in Everyday Life. And I ordered a copy for the library, so you'll be able to put that on hold later on if you like. And I'll turn it over to Kat from here if you want to say something.
Thank you, Vanessa, for the production. I'm fortunate enough to really work with, to connect with Dr. Asad, who is really researching the experiences of undocumented immigrants in the United States. He's a professor of sociology at Stanford University and a winner of some award. And I'm particularly engaged by his Engage and Evade book that really talks about the experiences of close to 11 million Americans who really constitute 3% of the total population of the United States. So I actually personally empathize with being undocumented, not because I was undocumented, but being close to being undocumented, because at one point before I became, a faculty at Eastern Washington University, I was resident alien. Non-resident alien. Do you know what non-resident alien means? And it's someone who's, I don't know how you can be non-resident where you live, actually. So I'm really fortunate. I'm really thankful that Dr. Asad agreed to come, because I couldn't believe when he said, he agreed to give it. His book is the most really engaging book. And I'm, without really wasting your time, I'm going to invite Dr. Asad to share his research, and we will have questions and answers at the end. But maybe welcome you with a round of applause.
Good evening, folks. Thanks for being here tonight. I often in my career find myself struggling against presidents. So when I gave my very first job interview, it was at the University of Michigan years ago, and all of the professors showed up to my job talk, but none of the graduate students did. It's because President Obama was on campus. And so all of the graduate students went to go visit President Obama, leaving me to the older folks, right? And that happened again a few years later. I was giving another job interview somewhere. And again, President Obama just happened to be on campus, and yet again, the grad students went away. And tonight, fortunately, I'm competing against President Joe Biden. So thank you all for choosing me over the current president and for being here tonight. I'm going to spend some time sort of giving a little bit of motivation for the book, and I'll do 2 readings, selections of readings from the book to give you some insight into the flavor of the book. In general, I started this project because I was really interested in understanding the reality of life for undocumented people, sort of immigrants who have settled in the United States long-term, but who for some reason or another don't have status to be here. So they sort of occupy this really difficult situation where they're here physically, but legally not present. They are visible in the sense that they live in housing, they rent apartments, they pay utility bills, they shepherd their kids to school, and yet they're invisible in the sense that they're not given passports or other kinds of identifying documents that would allow them to make their lives just a little bit easier as they take care of their children. But it's that tension between the visibility and the invisibility that I was really interested in studying as part of this book. And so I think the title Engage and Evade for me captures a lot of these dynamics that folks are dealing with in everyday life, which is that on the one hand, they are engaging with public authorities who have reason to punish them because they're undocumented. And yet that engagement is born out of a belief that that their interactions with these authorities help to promote their good, positive character as undocumented Americans. So I might be undocumented, but I'm a taxpayer. I might be undocumented, which is sometimes a crime in terms of entering the country without papers, and yet I don't have a criminal record because I volunteer in my community and I spend a lot of time helping the cops find folks in my neighborhood who may have sort of committed a crime they're looking to investigate. So it's these sort of counteracting, these counterbalancing acts of morality alongside positive caregiving that really give the book its title. The engagement to show how good I am, the evasion to show to minimize the possibility of me being seen as a bad person. And so to give a little bit of context of how I did that, and then I'll do some readings, and I'm happy. I'm a talker, so I would love sort of engagement and questions if you have them. But the way I started that was I was visiting Dallas as part of a research project, Dallas, Texas, in 2013. And as part of that experience, we went door knocking to randomly selected addresses in randomly selected neighborhoods throughout Dallas County. So we were looking for families who were white, Black, and Latino, who are of varying income levels, low, middle, and high income. And it just so happens that in Dallas, when you're looking for families with young children between the ages of 3 and 8, and you're also looking for Hispanic families, that overlap means that you're likely to find Hispanic immigrant families with young kids, because much of the low-income Hispanic population in Dallas overlaps with the immigrant population in Dallas, which is a heavy Latino immigrant population in that county. And so what started as a study of how people make trade-offs between where they send their kids to school, where they work, and where they live, emerged into something different, which is a study of how families who are navigating the threat of deportation by virtue of being undocumented balance this visibility and invisibility as they go about their everyday lives, working, raising kids, going to parent-teacher conferences, dealing with health issues that any one of us might deal with, but for whom they have particular difficulty doing it because they don't have access to health insurance in the US, whether public health insurance or, and of course, if any of you have ever bought private health insurance for yourself, you know how expensive it is, and they simply can't afford it. So that's how I started the research for the book in 2013. I followed a set of families in 2013, in 2014, in 2015, and I thought the study would be over then. I thought I would be able to tell a story about this threat of deportation. I don't know if you all remember the presidential election of 2016. It didn't quite go the way that the pundits had forecast. And so I decided I would go back to Dallas in 2018 to see how these same undocumented families were experiencing life under President Trump and his administration, which had adopted basically a very vocal anti-immigrant tone, and yet sort of the policies hadn't really changed all that much. There were some things around the margins, right? So the Muslim ban, which is a big thing. There were other things about immigration enforcement that changed, like the Obama administration prioritized deportations by criminal record, meaning that people who didn't have criminal records would not get deported. Whereas people under the Trump administration, it didn't matter whether you had a criminal record or not. They would deport you if they found you. But ultimately, the rates of deportation under President Trump actually did not exceed the rates of deportation under Obama. And in part, that's because of the pandemic, which of course sort of emerged in 2020. But the other part is simply, it's very expensive to deport people, to detain people, to deport people. So there's kind of a limit, given our current infrastructure, of how many folks can get deported. So that sort of gives you a little bit of context for one of the key ideas of the book, but it's not actually deportation, the act of being deported, that structures people's lives, but rather it's the possibility of deportation, the threat of deportation that structures people's lives. Because most undocumented immigrants, who count around, there's about 11 million of them in the US, most of them never have and never will be deported, simply because we don't have the capacity as a country to deport that many people every year. 300,000 people is around the limit, 300,000 to 400,000, given the current infrastructure that we have. Now, that doesn't minimize what deportation does to people who experience deportation. But since the vast majority of people will not experience deportation, I wanted to ask how people rooted in everyday neighborhoods, regular neighborhoods like we all occupy, understand what it means to go about daily life with all of the concerns that any one of us might have, on top of that, with the concerns about your legal status. And so I asked everyone in my study, sort of tell me about what a typical day looks like for you, from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to bed. You all can probably guess some of the answers. It would almost seem boring to the average observer, right? I wake up, I eat breakfast, I get ready for work, get my kids ready for work, or for school. I drop the kids off at school, I go to work, I work all day, then I go to bed. After I pick up the kids, feed them and get them ready for bath time, and so on and so forth. And these mundane, almost boring routine that people occupy, to sort of contrasted with a lot of the research on this topic, which heavily emphasize the people fleeing from the police, running from the police, always on the run from immigration authorities. And so I wanted to capture these kinds of everyday experiences and put them in the context of this larger threat narrative of the possibility of being deported from the country. And so the book starts from that premise that people live here and therefore carve out routines of daily life here. And then there are 4 substantive chapters. And the first one catalogs people's lives in their countries of origin, why they decided to migrate, why they chose not to migrate with papers. Some chose to migrate with papers because they had the opportunity to do so. But others didn't have the option because they didn't have the money, or they didn't have the time, or because something else happened that just forced them to sort of flee to the US, and fleeing, migration without papers turned out to be an option for them, given how frequent and common it was in their home communities. And then in the second chapter, and I'll give you a small reading from that in a second, I sort of think about, once you've settled here, you've set up in the US, you've lived here for a few years. Now, how is it that you deal with the threat of surveillance that you experience in everyday life? What does surveillance mean here? It's not that there are like cameras watching you everywhere. It means that there are people like we all might be scared of when we're driving, like police officers who can pull them over. And they may not be doing anything wrong, but they may not know they're doing anything wrong, in the sense that you might have a broken taillight and didn't know it. You might change lanes without signaling. And if there happens to be an officer who is there, you might get a ticket for it. It's just that that risk of ticketing sort of is a bit stronger for someone who doesn't have papers or who's undocumented in the US, simply because local police are the key conduit through which people get turned over to ICE these days. They represent about 55%. So local police stops account for about 55% of all eventual deportations from the United States. So there's a real nexus between getting a ticket behind the wheel and eventually getting deported from the country. And so I want to give you a small reading from the respondent who opens chapter 2 of the book. His name is Ricardo. I'll tell you a little bit about why I chose this in a second, but Ricardo is a man of contradictions, and you'll hear a couple of those contradictions as I read. So I won't read the full thing, but just enough to give you a flavor. Evening had started to give way to night when I exited the East R.L. Thornton freeway. I was on my way to visit Ricardo, who fled Honduras in 2001 following the gang-related murder of his mother. He lived in a new apartment complex just down the road. The parking lot was freshly serviced, surrounded by young elm trees. As I walked from the rental car, the air felt refreshingly light. The day's stifling 102-degree heat had finally relented. I knocked on the door, and after 2 minutes, Ricardo opened it and welcomed me inside. He was wrapped in a blue bath towel, fresh from the shower after working outside on his construction site all day. I had to wash the stink off of me, he said. We chatted quickly about interview logistics, deciding to talk over a late dinner at a nearby Chinese buffet. Ricardo disappeared into his bedroom to get dressed, emerging shortly thereafter in a muted yellow tee and dark green cargo shorts. Nestled in the corner booth at the run-of-the-mill Chinese buffet, plates full, Ricardo and I got to talking. This was our second conversation in as many years, and knowing that he entered the country unauthorized and continued to live here without authorization, I asked him whether he felt his legal status complicates any aspects of his daily life. Between bites of beef and broccoli, he sipped Coca-Cola from a frosted red cup. When you don't have documents, he said, you're always afraid. Anyone who doesn't have papers is afraid. We have to be careful. I prompted him to explain what he meant by being careful, what specifically he had to fear. He responded, you are afraid of the police stopping you because you've committed a crime and didn't know it. In Ricardo's mind, policing made salient his vulnerabilities as an undocumented immigrant. So I'll fast forward a little bit, but I couldn't have planned it better. We were sitting talking about policing when all of a sudden a cop car pulls into the parking lot just outside of the window next to our booth. We're watching these two police officers park, and they get out of the car and start walking toward the same restaurant. And Ricardo uses them as an example to illustrate his point about why, even though he's afraid of policing, he doesn't have to worry about being deported all of the time. He said, we can look out the window and see the police officers out there. You, Asad, are an American citizen, and I'm undocumented, but I'm in the same position as you. If you are behaving properly, why would a police officer come to arrest you? And why would they come to arrest me if I'm behaving properly? But if you are causing trouble and I'm still behaving properly, who will the officer arrest? You. I took a bite of my orange chicken, thinking about Ricardo's recognition of his vulnerabilities and his belief that he can manage these legal vulnerabilities in his everyday life. And perhaps sensing my thoughts, Ricardo emphasized, it's up to you to decide how long you want to be here. So this took me aback, because Ricardo was telling me now that for the undocumented immigrants who face deportation, it was really some personal failing of theirs that led to their removal from the country. And that was somewhat shocking to me, because I often am a sociologist. I think a lot about systems and structures, and yes, people make choices within imperfect systems, but here was someone who was a victim, or who was vulnerable to the possible victimization from the deportation system in this country, who's completely rejecting his own vulnerability here. So I asked Ricardo how he manages this tension between being a possible victim and being a sort of in control of his destiny. And he told me, without missing a beat, that he does a lot to try to offset the possible evaluations of him by police officers as a lowly undocumented immigrant. So he's undocumented, which means he doesn't have permission to work in the US, but Ricardo found a way to do so legally. He uses an individual tax ID number to register as an independent contractor who pays his own employment taxes, his own social security benefits, and all and the like, because this is a way that the IRS says, if you don't have a social security number, you can file your taxes and be within the scope of the law. But for Ricardo, it's not enough just to sort of show that he's a good taxpayer and a good citizen. He also wants to make sure he doesn't have a bad criminal record. And so, I asked Ricardo in the end if he could talk to any president, what he would say. And he said, a lot of us come here to work or to help our families. We should be allowed to stay here and be granted a pathway to citizenship. But for those who come here to drink, to steal, to harm others, why should they be given the opportunity to be here? Throw them back. So again, we're sort of confronting this really complex dynamic where Ricardo is telling me, on the one hand, he understands how vulnerable he is. On the other hand, he's telling me that he recognizes that there's a lot that he can do to avoid being deported. And on the third ticket, he's saying that, if given the opportunity, he would endorse a deportation system that sort of parrots a lot of the talking points of anti-immigrant advocates who say that, immigrants come to be criminals and to steal from the country. And Ricardo agrees that those kinds of people should be deported. So rather than finding something at fault with the broader system, he puts a lot of onus on the personal responsibility of every individual undocumented immigrant, which for me as a researcher was hard to reconcile and honestly hard to report for a couple of reasons. Number one is because I understand, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that there's a lot that he can control, but there's so much more that he cannot control. If the wrong officer finds him, or it's the wrong crime, or he forgets to pay a bill, or any number of things could happen. So he was a construction worker. Someone in Washington State actually had been arrested, who was a construction worker, had been arrested on charges of indecent exposure, and which is a mandatory deportation offense. What was that indecent exposure? This man was a construction worker who was urinating at his construction site, which did not have a porta potty for him. And an officer saw him, and he was deported because of an indecent exposure can be a felony depending on who is in the area. And so when I say that there's a lot out of Ricardo's control, that's an example. It didn't happen to Ricardo, but it happened to someone like Ricardo, which is why I make the argument in the book that there are a lot of laws and policies that people are aware of, and they can try to sort of plan around them in their everyday lives. But I think there's just as many that they're not aware of, simply because we as even experts uncover new policies, new regulations, new laws all the time. And so it's kind of hard to keep up with. So even just during the Trump administration, there were 1 year is 365 days. The Trump administration itself had over 400 policy changes related to immigration enforcement over that span of 4 years. I have a PhD on this stuff. I've been studying this stuff for over a decade, and it was hard for me to keep track. So the average person who might be vulnerable to those laws themselves might have a hard time. They understand the broad routines. They think they can manage their own lives. But at the end of the day, I think there's a lot that folks don't understand is out of their control. And I think we see some of that here in Ricardo's case. But still, Ricardo made it 23 years and still continues to live in Dallas as an undocumented immigrant. And so it continues to work for him, even as one day it might be interrupted. Now, one possible interruption that often happens for folks, we often think of undocumented immigrants as just standalone people. And they are, of course, full people who exist as independent entities. But they're also increasingly parents. So there are 11 million undocumented immigrants in the US. A fraction of them have US citizen children who were born here. There are about 5 million US citizen kids who have at least one undocumented parent. Well, it's a large number, about 80% of those kids are Latino. And so a large fraction of those US born kids whose parents are undocumented are part of a racialized ethnic group who then experience the harms that their parents suffer. So if a person is having a hard time working because they can't keep a stable job, because they don't have permission to work in the country, it's not just the parent who suffers, it's not just the undocumented immigrant who suffers, but also their children who rely on their parents having a livable income to be able to make ends meet, to afford school supplies, and so on and so forth. So in the book, we see a lot of the tensions that Ricardo described about sort of being law-abiding and working hard and getting a tax ID number and so on and so forth. We see a lot of these sentiments of sort of, we see a lot of those sentiments start to conflict with what it means to be a good parent in the US. So of course, parents are hardworking. Parents try to do their best to take care of their kids. But one thing that undocumented parents have to deal with, but a lot of sort of US born parents don't have to consider, is that when you're undocumented, you're excluded by law, many, certainly by federal law, and depending on the state that you live in, often excluded from public assistance. So if you're having trouble making ends meet, then, if you're a US citizen, it's pretty simple on average to go and get food stamps, for example, to help make ends meet. Or if you can't afford health and your job doesn't give you health insurance, so you can go and you certainly don't make enough money to pay for private health insurance, you can apply for Medicaid for low-income underinsured patients. Undocumented immigrants, by and large, don't have that luxury. And many will say, okay, it's fine that I can suffer. I accept that being here undocumented means I have to suffer. But as I sort of hinted at earlier, a lot of the times when you're undocumented and you have US citizen kids, your kids are inheriting some of the hardships that you face. And so I'll spend the last few minutes reading an excerpt from chapter 3, where I think about this dynamic of undocumented parents who are taking care of US citizen kids and how they manage this tension between being a hard worker, but also recognizing that they need help from the state government to take care of their US citizen kids, and what tensions those entail for their long-term stability in the US. I was outside a fortress. This building, a few minutes from downtown, stood out in this neighborhood of disinvested apartments. It was well guarded and maintained. On the other side of an iron gate were several potted plants lining a paved walkway and a small manicured stretch of grass. A never-ending row of large windows punctured the otherwise impenetrable brick facade. I used the intercom to dial Samuel and Selena's unit, and almost immediately, the curtains to a unit facing the street flung open. Two excited-looking children waved. One disappeared, and within a minute, emerged from the building to open the gate and accompany me inside. Samuel, handsome with olive skin, and Selena, whose flowing black hair accentuated her high cheekbones, were waiting for me at the marbled dining table just off their galley kitchen. Samuel had a cheery disposition, Selena a bit more reserved, but both were welcoming. The couple's warm reception contrasted with the coldness of the hardships they faced that motivated their move to the US. They grew up in neighboring rural towns in 2 different states in the southern part of Mexico. Their families depended on subsistence farming to get by, Samuel and Selena both left school at an early age to work to support their households. Neither had envisioned a life for themselves in the US, but in the late 90s, more and more people from their hometowns were heading north. Their own journey soon seemed inevitable. Samuel left first in 2002, finding work in a factory packing gum and cigarettes alongside his oldest brother, who had arrived a few years before him. He saved what he could to pay for a smuggler to escort Selena, who was carrying their first child, into the country safely. Selena miscarried before Samuel had saved enough, but by 2003, the couple had reunited in Dallas. The hardships that had characterized their lives in Mexico followed them to the US, compounded by the constraints of their legal status. By the time I met the couple in 2003, they counted more than 10 years living in the country undocumented. And despite feeling caged in by their legal status, Samuel and Selena have tried to make a life for themselves. Samuel, who works in a nearby mattress factory, earns about $14,000 a year. Selena, who used to clean homes in the area, is a stay-at-home mom to the couple's 4 children under the age of 8, all born in the US. Finances were tight. We don't have rich people's lives, Samuel acknowledged, but we can buy what we need to survive. Many service institutions, like hospitals and welfare agencies, have been pivotal to that survival. 2 years after Selena's arrival in the country, sudden stomach pain sent her to a nearby emergency room. A nurse offered her a pregnancy test, and upon discovering that Selena was pregnant, encouraged her to sign up for Texas's Children's Health Insurance Program and special supplemental nutrition program for women, infants, and children, more commonly known as WIC. CHIP has an unborn child option, which allows pregnant women of any legal status to have 10 prenatal care visits and up to 2 postnatal care visits. And then as long as they continue to meet income eligibility requirements, the kid remains enrolled once they're born, even as the mother falls out of the program. And WIC offers sort of a basic basket of milk and other kinds of basic necessities for the kid until the age of 5. Every year they renewed, and Samuel and Selena spend a lot of time sort of dealing with caseworkers and social workers as part of that effort. But it also turned out that Samuel and Selena would need to spend a lot more time with caseworkers a few years later, after the birth of their 3rd child, whom doctors diagnosed with a life-threatening cancer at just 6 years old. Treatment would not be easy. It required years' worth of chemotherapy and radiation. And initially, Samuel, Selena, and their 4 kids found themselves all but living at the hospital. A hospital social worker informed them that additional forms of public assistance were available that might help to alleviate some of their burden. Things moved fast after that. The social worker contacted Samuel's employer to shorten his workday so that he and Selena could take turns at being present for all their kids. To offset the reduced income, the social worker helped the family apply for food stamps, as well as disability insurance for the kid who had the life-threatening health condition, which offers financial support to US citizens with severe functional limitations. And finally, the social worker secured public housing for the family, and that's where we conducted all 4 interviews when I talked to the families between 2013 and 2018. So I asked the couple whether these hardships that characterize their everyday lives weighed on them as they received public goods from these different places. And both quickly corrected me. They received nothing as parents. It was their children for whom the benefits were made available, and their children were eligible because they are US citizens. This distinction was important, as Samuel explained to me. He said the government doesn't give help to those of us who are undocumented, just those people who were born here. So I asked him why he felt he had to tell me this distinction. And he said, because imagine what would happen if we didn't get these services for our kids and we can't afford to take them to the doctor, get them the care that they need. He said, imagine if something were to happen to them. We would be in a lot of trouble. So Selena took over and she said, partly agreeing with Samuel and partly reminding him that they might still find themselves in trouble with immigration authorities down the road, saying a lot of undocumented immigrants take public benefits for their kids, and so far nothing has happened to them. But I don't know, to be honest. We have to be careful. And Samuel countered, recalling what the hospital social worker had explained to them. If either faces deportation, quote, we can use the help we received for our children to help us stay here, since the kids can't be here without us. So let me tell you a little bit about this dynamic. You've got a lot of confusion in this household. You've got two parents who work hard but have a hard time taking care of their kids because of various medical issues that one of the kids has. Samuel was working long hours in a mattress factory, but not earning a whole lot of money. He had actually cycled through a few jobs over the years that I met him, mostly because when you work undocumented, you're often fired without notice because the Department of Labor might audit your papers and discover that your papers are no good. So your employer says you can correct the papers or you can go home. And a lot of people can't correct those papers, and so they go home. And so Samuel had a lot of job instability, and on top of that, Samuel and Selena were dealing with the health challenges of their kid, in addition to the challenges of just raising 4 kids more generally. So they found themselves relying on public assistance to support their families and to make ends meet. But neither of the parents actually qualified for any of the benefits they were receiving, and therein lies the tension. If you're undocumented and you apply for benefits for yourself, you become what's known as you risk becoming what's known as a public charge, someone who primarily relies on the government for sustaining your life in the US. And if you are a public charge, according to immigration authorities, that means you can never legalize to become a green card holder and ultimately a US citizen. But there is a carve out in the law. And the carve out is exactly this, where although I might be ineligible for public assistance because I'm undocumented, if my kids are US citizens, they are entitled to the benefits that I'm applying to on their behalf, because I am the conduit through which they receive these benefits. Now, if you're sitting here and wondering, well, wait, undocumented folks get public benefits. That is the wrong interpretation. The right interpretation is, we live in a country that excludes undocumented immigrants from federally funded and state funded public health insurance programs and other kinds of social supports. But our policymakers have actually built in these carve-outs under the assumption that we are denying the parents of US citizen kids opportunities to live here as full members of society. And so we make available these resources to the kids on the basis of their US citizenship, with the expectation that these undocumented parents actually seek out these benefits, because rather than legalize them or give them work authorization or something like that, we say this is a way to help them sort of continue to offer their labor to us for cheap to the country, even as we continue to make it hard for them to raise their kids and make ends meet. So you might discover, if you dig a little deeper in the immigration space, this is a very common sentiment where we make choices as a country, and some of our state governments also make choices to exclude undocumented immigrants from things that might be very beneficial to them, like a Social Security number. They used to have access to those until 1972, when we as the federal government decided to take those away. And with the suffering that emerges from that, you can't document you're without a Social Security number, you can't have work authorization. Without work authorization, you can't have a stable job. Without a stable job, it means you have very limited recourse to, if your employer chooses not to pay you, you work in tough jobs that are physically demanding, you're often paid under the table, you don't have a retirement income long-term. So all of these things start to compound. And so, then there's this movement to sort of support the children, because turns out US citizens are suffering because we make choices to deny undocumented immigrants access to these benefits. And ultimately, it's a sort of merry-go-round of exclusion, inclusion, exclusion, inclusion. So you're excluded as an undocumented immigrant, but you're included as the parent of a US citizen child. And so that's that kind of dance that these undocumented parents in my study are doing. And I'll call attention to the very last bit that Selena described, or that Samuel described, which is that, you know, if one day they face deportation, they might be able to use the records of their assistance that they've received on behalf of their kids to be able to stay here. Now, what is that about? So you all might laugh at this phrase, but there is a carve-out in immigration law that will stop someone's deportation if they meet certain eligibility requirements. Some things are about how long you've been here, some things are about other things, but the carve-out is called cancellation of removal for exceptional and extremely unusual hardship. So what is exceptional and extremely unusual hardship? So it's essentially that if I'm deported, I have to document the possible consequences of my deportation on a qualifying permanent resident or US citizen relative. So I might be undocumented, but for various reasons, my mom, dad, child, or spouse might be a US citizen. And so if I can document some form of exceptional and extremely unusual hardship of my removal on those people, one of those people, an immigration judge might decide to pardon me from my deportation. And if they decide to make that pardon, I can also apply for a green card and be on the pathway to citizenship. As you might imagine, well, you know, well, why don't folks just try to get themselves deported to legalize that? Turns out it's a very hard standard to meet, that cancellation, the exceptional and extremely unusual hardship. Because if I'm deported and I say that my kid is going to suffer, they're going to miss me, he's going to be sad if I go home, go back to Mexico, wherever, that's not exceptional and extremely unusual hardship. That is known as a common consequence of deportation. What's exceptional and extremely unusual hardship would be like this kid that has this life-threatening cancer, who has to go to a doctor's office, you know, once every 3 weeks to have regular chemotherapy appointments, who has to have medical checkups every 6 months, where the parents basically have a full-time job to take care of this child, who would ultimately die without the parents there because of how sick he is. That is kind of the threshold we're talking about here for exceptional and extremely unusual hardship. Not that my kids will miss me, not that they'll be sad, not that, you know, my mom will cry all day, none of that. It has to be so this higher level, or this higher order level of cruelty and hardship. And so it is the case that about 5,000 undocumented immigrants a year who find themselves in immigration court take records like the disability enrollment that their kid is in, like, you know, if someone might have a serious psychiatric problem resulting from someone's arrest or deportation. They might start seeing a therapist, and the therapist might describe them as suicidal, for example. And that might reach the level of exceptional and extremely unusual hardship. But one thing that I show in the book, though, is that there was one family who had benefited from that cancellation of removal for exceptional and extremely unusual hardship. But there's a backlog. Once a judge says, okay, you qualify, we're going to cancel your removal, there's about a 5-year backlog between that cancellation and when you finally get your green card. And so in that interim period, what happens is that if you get picked up if you leave the country without permission, the federal government takes that as evidence that you don't actually want to be here. And so that happened to one of the study families where the husband was approved for cancellation of removal. His dad in Guatemala died all of a sudden. And so he was so distraught with grief and left the country without seeking permission from immigration authorities first, as he was waiting for his green card. Not only did he receive a deportation order for leaving the country, but his wife and oldest daughter also received deportation notices because they had cases that were attached to his. And because of that, they all had to, including one of their daughters who's a US citizen by birth, all had to go back to Guatemala. They lived there for a few years before there was gang activity in the village. And the wife and the oldest daughter made the trek from Guatemala through Mexico into the United States back to Texas, turning themselves into immigration officials at the border saying, hey, you know, we're claiming asylum because of gang activity and so on and so forth. Fast forward, they had a case for 6 years with immigration authorities, waiting for their day in immigration court. They finally had their day in court. And this is not in the book because the case had only wrapped up in December of this past year, of 2023. The wife, so the husband stayed behind in Guatemala, now they're actually divorced, but the wife and the oldest daughter, the daughter married an army veteran and was finally able to get a green card through her husband. The mom, though, had such a hard time. She had been in this deportation case for 6 years. And finally, they wrote, her attorney suggested that the only effort that they hadn't tried yet was to get her community to write letters of support for how moral and good of an undocumented immigrant she is. So this woman collected 37 letters from friends and family members, or friends and coworkers who are US citizens, attesting to how good she is as a person. The immigration judge read all these 37 letters and decided that Maite, in the book, her name is Maite, decided that Maite reaches this bar, this threshold of being such a good person that the judge had exercised the discretionary authority to close the case against Maite. But Maite remains undocumented. So the judge didn't have the authority to give Maite a green card because she wasn't canceling the removal on the basis of exceptional, extremely unusual hardship. She was just canceling the removal, which leaves Maite now as an undocumented immigrant, but nobody is searching for her. She doesn't have status. She's not a green card holder, but no one is searching for her. And the structure of our current immigration system is such that we have a lot of people for whom no one is searching, and yet they're not advancing in terms of this journey toward US citizenship because they don't have that opportunity. So this kind of moment, again, of being here, but not really being here. And so a lot of the book, and especially in the conclusion, I think a lot about that tension. And I leave you all with these words, which is, you know, one of the punchlines of the book is that surveillance that undocumented immigrants have to deal with is as much about the threat of punishment as it is the hope for inclusion, this sort of eventual hope that they'll become permanent full members of society. And I think what we're realizing every day is that no matter how good you are, no matter how well you pay your taxes, no matter how limited of a criminal record you have, there's no way in this current system that allows people a path, a legitimate path out of their undocumented status. And so when you hear immigration advocates call for a legalization program or amnesty or reform, they're not always talking about citizenship. In fact, many of the undocumented immigrants in my book don't actually want citizenship. All they want is the freedom to work without the threat of deportation hanging over them. And you can get that through a work visa. You can get that through something like DACA, you've all heard of for the Dreamers. If you had a fuller version of that, that maybe you could renew every 5 years instead of every 2 years. I think most people in my study would accept it because it's better than the current version, which is I could be deported any day for no reason whatsoever. So I'll leave you on that and look forward to receiving any questions. Thank you all for your time and attention. Yes, sir, please.
Sounds to me that the system you described encourages crime. That, well, hell, I can't do it, I can't survive legally. Why don't I steal or do drugs, deal drugs for a living? Have you researched that incentive?
Yeah, so the question for those in the Zoom land is, it seems like many of the dynamics that I described seem to encourage crime because people can't do things the right way And so they have to find alternate ways of living and making ends meet in this country. And actually, I have to tell you, the folks that I talk to are super aware that they broke the law, between quotations coming in. And so actually much of their lives in the US is meant to be exactly what you'd expect, which is following the letter of the law as much as they can. So I don't observe in my group of folks that I studied, crime rates, they're not selling drugs, they're not dealing drugs. They're working long hours in low-wage jobs and trying their best to make ends meet because exactly this, they want to avoid the perception that they are criminal. And in fact, selling drugs is one of those offenses, no matter how small, if you smell like sell a small bit of marijuana, that is a mandatory deportation for most undocumented immigrants. And so a lot of the people in my study avoid that. And statistically, actually, undocumented immigrants are far less likely than US born citizens to commit any crime. So crime rates are lower in areas where the undocumented population is highest. And the reason for that is simply because, you come into a country, you're already so worried about sort of being here illegally, you're just going to live like an average person, which is just going about your business, doing your everyday life. And beyond that, I think one thing that I try to make in the book is that these aren't people who are just like wake up one day and decide to become an immigrant. These are people who in their home countries had routines, some of them had jobs, but they all also understood sort of this tradition of like, respecting the law and being a good person and a good citizen. All of those behaviors come with them as they enter the US. And I think what's on display in the book is sort of an extra performance of that to show like, yeah, maybe I broke the law coming in, but that was the exception. The norm for me is to be a good person. And so I think that's why I see a lot of people actually work really hard to try to avoid any kind of extra criminality once they're here.
Actually, the Almas stuff.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
I wanted to ask you that I think you're not a fan of the student. Even with that status, I'll make sure careful, like I wouldn't do what other college students would be doing, because I know that the consequence of doing the same thing that my peers do would be huge.
Yeah.
I could get deported and not be able to extend my degree. And so I think people don't realize that even documented immigrants have to be extra careful because we could do
Yeah, so for about 20% of all deported people in any given year are actually green card holders, so lawful permanent residents. And that's exactly, as our colleague over here was saying, that's exactly because when you're not a US citizen, a lot of crimes that we might think of as people having fun or college students being college students actually become criminalized behaviors for undocumented immigrants. So drinking underage, getting a DUI, smoking some marijuana, all of that, which you might expect of a typical college student, just experimenting and having fun, can lead to deportation for international students and immigrants more broadly who are not US citizens. And I think sort of that reality is why you see a lot of undocumented immigrants try really hard to keep it together and be as good and moral as they possibly can.
Oh, the most simple thing is to carry your document with you. Like I was an international student. One of the biggest crimes at all times, you have to have your international passport, your I-20 and everything in your bag. If you don't carry that, forget about committing crime. This is a different thing. I always tell my friends that if you go to upstate New York, please visit Niagara Falls, because I didn't get the chance to visit because I didn't want to do anything illegal.
So both my parents are naturalized citizens.
Yeah.
They've been naturalized citizens for a long time. If you open my dad's wallet, which I'm prone to do, just to dig through it, he doesn't keep any cash in there. He just keeps a lot of papers and bills and weird things that shouldn't be in a wallet. And one thing that I found was his naturalization card. So it's effectively this laminated document that proves he's a US citizen. And my dad has been in this country for, 5 decades at this point. He said, Dad, why do you carry around your naturalization card? He said exactly this, which is he just feels, as a US citizen, he's fine, he can't be deported. But he feels better with that card on him to prove that he belongs here in a way that my mom, who is also a naturalized citizen, does not. And so I think through that in the preface of the book. And it's sort of this reality for a lot of immigrants that much of their lives are documented by paperwork and other kinds of institutional authorities, that you want to make sure you always have the right paperwork and avoid the wrong paperwork. And I think these criminalizable offenses, drinking, drugs, selling drugs, and so on and so forth, are things that a lot of immigrants work very hard to avoid, simply because it means that if they're caught, even if they're just, boys will be boys, girls will be girls, they will, the meanings of being caught for them are very different than like a typical college student who's a US citizen. Yeah.
Can you speak at all to emotional toll that this takes?
Yeah. So like the question for those in the Zoom land is about the emotional toll of all of this. And I think that I call this the psychic toll. It's true that, there's a lot that you have to hold on to when you live under this sort of period of duress, this time of duress. I'm undocumented. If I go to the grocery store and there's a cop on the street and I get picked up and I don't have a license and I get a ticket for driving without a license, I won't be able to afford my groceries. If I don't pay the ticket though, then I might get a second ticket, and then that will look like in their computer that I'm not a good person because I didn't pay my last ticket. So they might arrest me until I pay my 2 tickets. But in the time that I'm arrested and being held in this jail, perhaps immigration authorities will come and get me, and then I'll get deported, or at least have to fight with a lawyer. So it really does add a lot of sort of mental toll in terms of mental health, psychological distress. There's very good evidence of that. We're also finding good evidence of physical health effects, that the more active immigration enforcement is, the more that stress that you feel about that threat of deportation enters the body. You can see it even finishing up a research article about this. You can also see it in the bodies of pregnant women, that it passes on, the stress that they feel during the pregnancy with the kid passes on to the kid in the form of a low birth weight. And that low birth weight outcome is correlated with all kinds of things as that kid grows: developmental delays, physical health problems, and so on and so forth. And so we also see that undocumented immigrants who are suffering from the psychic toll of deportation that enters the body and also passes along to the next generation of US citizen kids. And so it's very much a multi-generational kind of punishment in that way. I think we're running low on time, so I'm going to take maybe one last question from the back.
It was more like a comment because recently, Spokane Public School has a policy to ban border patrol agents from entering in school. I think if people understand kind of the emotional toll that families carry with them, they might be more sympathetic. So what happened was, for some reason, border patrol agents have, from time to time, they went to elementary school to tell stories. And so some of the immigrant families said, no, this is going to cause a lot of fear and anxiety among the children in the elementary school. And so finally, a couple of media organizations protested against that, and the school district of legally passed that policy to ban border patrol agents from entering the school. But I think a lot of people don't understand why it is a big deal. We would, was just there reading stories, why people have such a big reaction.
It's so tough when you see, you're at your kid's school, and it's supposed to be a safe haven for the kid and for the families of the kid. And then you see sort of an officer in uniform, an immigration officer in uniform in that school district. There is good evidence from colleagues at Stanford that when ICE performs immigration raids, the population of the public schools decreases dramatically in the months afterwards. And that's because a lot of the families who are undocumented will pull their kids out of one school district and move a couple of counties over to try to get away from a threat of immigration enforcement. And so when we talk about the psychic toll being multi-generational, that's another example.
Are you able to identify a national interest to all of this?
A national interest to keeping folks
In
on.
other words, is there a national motive? I mean, we go to war to steal property.
Yeah,
That's a national interest.
Yeah.
Why do we maintain this, what would you call it, confused, jumbled policy?
yeah,
And what might be the motive for it?
yeah. What's the motive for keeping folks undocumented and having this jumbled system? My honest answer is labor. And so we're able to exploit a lot of people's labor, keep paying them low wages to keep our costs down, that we all benefit from, right? When you go to the grocery store and you see avocados for $2 or $3, that's because those avocados are picked off of the backs of farm laborers who are being paid next to nothing in grueling conditions to pick strawberries, avocados, and whatever. And that's just a very direct example. You see a lot of that as well in other countries, whether in the Middle East or in South America. It's always sort of the most vulnerable people who are immigrants, who are working in the lowest rung occupations, that we as US citizens see as beneath us at this point, because they've been typecast as being jobs now for undocumented folks. And so now you see a lot of that labor maintenance is about keeping, a lot of the reason why we maintain our undocumented population is because we need their labor to survive. You remember during the pandemic, the earliest bit, the farm workers were called essential workers. So you had undocumented immigrants having papers from the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Labor that identified them as essential labor. That's also why deportations went down a whole lot during the early part of the pandemic. And it's because we all needed their labor to keep the country going so we could all eat. And so there's a great book about that called Deported by my colleague Tanya Gulash-Bosa, who's at the University of California, Merced. And she really talks about this global system of labor and capitalism that which is why our country maintains the undocumented flow. In my book, I talk less about that, and I talk more about sort of the consequences of that system on people's lives. Yeah, thank you. And thank you all so much. We're out of time, and I want to get you all going. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Of course, I'm going to turn off.
We have